everybody, and welcome to Author Nook with Jordan H. Bartlett. I am Jordan H. Bartlett, and it is our first episode of 2026 and our first episode of season 5. I am the author of Contest of Queens, Queen's Catacombs, and Queendom Come, and I'm here today with the Renaissance and medieval master, author, and antiquarian bookseller, Sienna Wells. Welcome, Sienna.
Hello, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm really excited to be speaking today with everyone.
I am so excited to chat all things medieval. And today's topic is medieval manuscripts, the who's who and the how to. But before we jump in, I would like to know a little bit more about you, Sienna. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a medieval manuscript dealer working at Tom W. Ailing, and I run the medieval and Renaissance manuscript department, and I've been working in the antiquarian book trade since the winter of 2024. I studied English literature and creative writing in Brighton for my undergraduate, and then I changed to history of art for my master's. And it was during that time that I really discovered the medieval period and my love for it. My lecturer at the time was making a passing comment about Nicholas Rolland's books, and he was the chancellor for Philip the Good in the 15th century. And I hadn't come across medieval books before, or book history in all honesty. And I started looking and I had no clue what I was looking at, but there was just something really, really enchanting about them. And then this bled into a full-blown obsession, which completely changed what I wanted to specialize in. And I had to learn every single thing I possibly could about medieval books just to begin to understand how to produce a thesis on them. And then since then, I've worked in the auction trade, in museums and art galleries, in a variety of different roles before joining the book trade. But in general, I just have a huge appreciation of all things old and with a story.
I love it. When I first started looking into our topic of conversation today, I realized there were so many terms I didn't know because it's almost like a new language. So could you deep dive a little bit more for us into some of those terms? So I'm thinking specifically, what are we thinking when we hear the word medieval manuscript? And what are we thinking when we hear the term Book of Hours?
It's a really great point because there are lots of different terms, and I think they're actually quite complicated in some ways to define. So, medieval and manuscript. So, medieval is a long stretch of time, the period, and it's really difficult to pinpoint a date as it's really debated. I roughly say the 5th, 6th century to the mid 15th, 16th centuries, but it isn't a hard and fast rule. And in the context of this podcast, I'm discussing manuscripts that were produced in medieval Europe within a Christian context. And manuscripts are anything that is written by hand. And manuscripts aren't solely constrained to the medieval period, but a medieval manuscript essentially is a handwritten book that is produced during the medieval period itself. And that can include a variety of genres. So you've got literature and romance, courtly love and adventure with Arthurian legends such as Le Morte d'Arthur, which was written in the 15th century. And you've got Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And then you kind of go to more religious books, such as the personal prayer book called A Book of Hours. And the Book of Hours is considered to be a medieval bestseller. They range from very simple to luxurious books. They could be really pristine or very well thumbed. And they were essentially a devotional manual designed for personal prayer containing offices and other religious texts, also called hours. And each office is centered around a specific theme, such as the Virgin Mary. And the office of the Virgin Mary was a particular favorite during the medieval times. And these consisted of psalms, hymns, readings, and prayers. And it was a simplified version of the divine office and was adapted for use by everyday people rather than those working in a religious context. And the term hours kind of refers to the specific times of day designated for prayer, and it followed a kind of daily structure. And they were starting to become very, very popular in the 13th and 14th centuries. And if you were going to have any book during the medieval period, it would be this one. So,
Oh, I love it. And it just, like you said, they could be pristine or well thumbed, and there's just so much history behind the ones that have survived. And we still get to see that we're from a time so different to our own. Like thinking of all the different ways that they moved about their day without all of the things we just take for granted. And then we have this relic that was so close to their heart and home that we can still enjoy and kind of glean information from. That's so exciting.
Mhm.
And so when we're thinking of the creation of these beautiful texts, because they must be very well made, given that they've lasted so many centuries, how were they created or what went into their creation? What kind of people were involved? How long would it take to create a simple one versus a more elaborate one?
So it's a really good question, and you're completely right in saying, it's a testament to how they were made, is how they've lasted so long because they're very durable as objects. The first stages of creating a medieval manuscript was to create the leaves of a book, and that was primarily made from parchment during the medieval period. And parchment is made from animal skin. Another term that you might be familiar with or heard of is vellum, and that refers to a very specific type of animal skin, that being calf. And the types of animals that were often used were sheep, goats, or calves, but it really depended on what animals were farmed in that area. And the process of creating parchment involves multiple stages. So you kind of start by washing the skin and you'd soak it in a lime solution for a few days. And the hair was scraped off and it was rinsed again to get the solution off. And it kind of went through this process of stretching, drying in a frame, and it was scraped. And it was a very smelly and quite a long process. And after this, it would be cut into sheets, and the waste parts would be kind of kept to make cheaper pieces. And the rest would be folded and ruled. The main text would then be copied onto the parchment by a scribe. And then after this, illumination was added. Not all books would have decorations, but if they did, gold would go on first and then other colours would follow. And then the sheets could be gathered and put into a binding. But the stages kind of before ownership can feel quite detached, as it wasn't very common for a scribe or illuminator to sign their works. But from the start to the finish, it was a very timely and costly process. But the length of time really depended on how long the manuscript was and who was making it and when. Um, and it also depended on how many people were contributing, because again, there wasn't really a hard, fast set rule, because some manuscripts would have multiple people working on it and some wouldn't. And in the early medieval period, manuscript production was mainly within a monastic context. And then as we got later into the medieval period, around the 13th century, we started to see commercial workshops, and it started getting much quicker to produce manuscripts. But, a monk or a nun would have other commitments, so they wouldn't be able to dedicate significant hours at one time to a book. So it could take them years. But a professional scribe working in the 15th century, when the commercial trade was really going, could work significantly faster, and they were often paid by the job rather than the hour. So there was kind of this incentive to get it done. And different artisans could work on a book concurrently. So when one scribe finishes a gathering, they could give it to an illuminator, and then they'd be kind of working together. But there's not really a set time, but it definitely got a lot quicker as the medieval period progressed.
Wow. And it really sounds like it almost starts as a an aspect of ritual, an aspect of meditation, because you said it started with the in the monasteries. And then as the need grew, then we started to get more into that commercialization. But I can imagine um those earlier texts, it's almost like every stitch would have been done with love and intention. And that is the most special thing. Like, I'm getting a bit emotional thinking about it. That's the most special
Mhm.
thing to think of, because not only are these texts then used in someone's daily prayer for years and in the household and maybe passed along from generation to generation, but the creation of these texts have a maybe complete stranger pouring parts of themselves into it too.
Mm.
What a beautiful process and just like treasure that then again in modern day we can go to museums and we can see these texts. And I've seen your videos on socials. You're holding these
Mm.
texts, which I don't know if I think my fingers would shake too much. How does that feel to just be in the presence of something like this?
Oh, it's so wonderful. And I think the best way to describe it is when you're holding a medieval manuscript or just one part of one, it's like you're holding the hands of every person that has come through its life. And whether that is they were a significant player or someone who just had it really, really briefly, every interaction through time pours something else into that manuscript. And books are made to be held and to be used and to be touched. And it is important we preserve these items and keep them safe, but also it's important that we look at them and learn from them. So it's a really special thing, and I feel so lucky that I can hold them at work and study them essentially.
Yeah, yeah, a book should not be behind a glass case, that's for sure. Oh,
Mhm.
so beautiful. And so you've mentioned a few very quirky and different ingredients, like the calf skin and then putting gold on the pages already. But was there an odd superstition or step to the process involved in making these books that kind of sticks out to you as intriguing and very different to how we just send a book to the printers and hope for the best?
I guess the one thing that comes to mind is like pigments, because we if people paint or draw now, you can kind of just go to a shop and get a piece of like a ready-made tube of paint. But in the medieval period, you couldn't really do that at all. And they would be made by manufacturing kind of different materials together or from the natural world. And I guess one of my favorite ones is lichen creates an amazing pigment called ochre. And lichen is a complex organism made up of both algae and fungus. And you can go see it on trees outside. It's kind of like well, there's lots of different species, but it's kind of mossy looking thing. And it was one of the pigments that was used to illuminate the Book of Kells. And, people went out and foraged for materials. And once the lichen was collected, the color purple could be extracted by soaking the lichens for weeks at a time in an ammonia fluid, which was often urine, so quite smelly and unpleasant, which allowed it to ferment. And then that created orchil, which was a purple dye. And you would use a binding agent such as egg white or natural gum with water. And it could be derived from different species of lichen, but it wasn't very stable and it would often flake. But it was just things like this, every pigment has its own story and origin. And the fact that someone went and kind of found out how to make a pigment is so fascinating in itself, and it's science ultimately. Iron galling was made from oak galls which grow on oak trees, and they're crushed and then boiled, and it's it is just to me it's incredible. It's a piece of magic, and the fact that these pigments have also lasted so long, it's just like there's nothing more magical than that. But it's quite a strange thing when you look at it and be like, oh, that's come from lichen or that's come from a bit of a tree. So yeah.
Wow. Yeah, and I think I went through an era where I was a redhead, and I think one red hair dye would last maybe a couple months before it was just straight out the hair. So yeah, you're right. For those pigments to last, obviously a book isn't getting washed 3 to 5 days, every 3 to 5 days, but for those pigments to last, just people running their fingers, which we've got oils on our fingertips for many, many years, and stay so vibrant. Because this is what
Mm,
strikes me when you look at these medieval manuscripts and these books of hours, is the colors just pop in such a beautiful way.
mm.
Yeah.
No, they do, and I think it is incredible, particularly when you see books that haven't got a lot of signs of use in them, and they look like they've just come straight from the monastery or scriptorium or whatever. It's amazing. It's the colors have been preserved so well, and some pigments last longer than others, and they all kind of fare in their own ways, and it is amazing. And also that we can, go back in time through looking at pigments and work out kind of where you can localize manuscripts that way as well. Kind of, oh, how would they have gotten that material? What does that tell us? So there's lots of kind of secrets in manuscripts. It's just kind of going below the surface.
Oh, of course. Yeah, if there's a regional lichen that only gives this color and you find a manuscript with only that color, you could definitely, oh, that, see, fascinating. That is so cool. It's like your Sherlock Holmeses of the manuscript world.
So I guess it does feel like that. You're kind of like a little medieval detective, and obviously once trade links started, you kind of start. It's harder then to define. Okay, but particularly in the earlier manuscripts, you can learn so much by just looking at pigment qualities, and it's really fascinating.
Yeah. And then you were mentioning before some are very well preserved, some have been well loved. And then if we're thinking about what that human element looks like when we're analyzing a text, what kind of tells are you looking for that gives us in the present day more clues about either the person who created that manuscript or the person who owned and then used that manuscript?
So this is a particular favorite kind of area of mine. Sometimes medieval manuscripts where the stories of their owners and creators silently or sometimes very loudly. And one way of seeing people through their manuscripts is through an owner's sign of use. And this could be really overt, such as a name inscribed on a page, dates of birth or anniversaries, annotations, or sometimes a book curse, which is always quite fun.
Like
But
a curse
sometimes
curse?
yeah, so people would write, this wasn't just the medieval period, but people would sometimes write quite threatening curses, sometimes in a humorous way, sometimes not, basically warning people off from damaging or stealing their books, which I think is like quite fantastic. I think we should bring it back personally. They're really good fun, and yeah, you can look them up online. Some of them are quite harrowing to read. Um, but sometimes it's a lot more subtle than that, and it's through the physical interactions that are left on the page. So the Book of Hours, which is the personal prayer book that was really popular during the medieval period, you can sometimes see signs of use through kissing and rubbing of miniatures, which was quite a common practice when going through different prayer cycles. And in the office where I work currently, we have a Book of Hours that was produced in the 15th century in Lyon, and it's literally like roughly the size of my palm. And there is an office within the prayer book called the Office of the Dead. And the primary function of that office was that it was to be recited after someone had passed away. And in the opening miniature, there are two priests conducting kind of a burial, and to the right, there's some monks who are watching a grave digger lowering a body into the ground. And this sort of image was very, very common to begin the Office of the Dead. So when you look a bit closer, you can see that the pigment of the two priests have been rubbed away with a finger so that the parchment is visible underneath. And with the body being lowered into the ground, the pigment had completely disappeared as if it had been rubbed or picked away during prayer. And this is a visual piece of someone's grief. And by the amount that the pigment has gone, it would suggest that it'd been returned to more than once. And, grief, whether it's 500 years old or not, is still grief. And this page, it could have been one incredibly significant death. And this was their way of still connecting with that person, or they could have had a lot of loss during their life. And it's when you're holding someone's prayer book, there's such an intimacy about how people would touch and handle their books. You're partially touching their fingertips, their tears, their mouths as they kind of kiss the pages and like say goodbye or are in joy. And I guess the one thing to remember is books, yes, they're fantastic, but it's the people that make them. And you see mistakes that scribes have left, and again, that tells you something about them. And they'd make quite a lot of spelling mistakes, or they would kind of overrun their lines, and you can imagine how frustrating that actually probably was. And they might have been scolded at work and then gone home and complained about their day to a loved one, or it's just things like that you kind of they can be easily missed, but it's when you kind of really it's close looking and looking out for signs of people. Like there's quite a funny one in the Book of Kells. where, I guess we can really romanticize what it's like to be a medieval scribe, sitting in a beautiful monastery, writing by candlelight, perhaps, copying out texts in Latin. It can sound quite therapeutic, but in reality, it was probably incredibly cold, quite a strain on your eyes and your back and your hands, and you'd be working long hours. And in the books of Kells, a scribe left a little note kind of saying, I'm so tired of this, and I wish it was finished. I'm so cold. And not only does that tell us something about the conditions, but again, it's about the people, and it's there's something so magical about that.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, and it's the nature of humanity at its core
Mm.
is universal across centuries, you know? Nobody likes to be cold. No one likes to have stiff joints. No one likes to work long hours. And the scribes in the medieval time feel just as we do in our modern era when the
Mhm.
heating goes out in the office and you've got a little space heater under your desk.
Yeah.
And then how did gender shape manuscript production? Were there certain roles that women played in creating the manuscript that might have differed from their male counterparts?
So there's a very, very common perception that men were the makers of medieval manuscripts, particularly when there's an unnamed scribe or illuminator, which is incredibly frequent. People would tend to assume that it was a male, but that's not always the case because women existed as scribes, illuminators, book traders, and runners of workshops. And one piece of evidence that we have for female scribes is through colophons. So colophons are a note that has typically been left by a scribe on the last leaf of a manuscript, which supplies information such as names. And in 2025, the University of Bergen did a bibliometric study that determined that I think at least 110,000 manuscripts were copied by female scribes, of which 8,000 should still exist. And they also mentioned a colophon from a female scribe named Birgitta from the 15th century. And there were other ways that you could identify female scribes if they referred to themselves as scriptrix, which is a female scribe, or soro, which is sister in Latin. Um, and the medieval book trade was regulated by the establishment of guilds when it was commercialized. And there are some examples of guild records which give us an insight into not only the early operations of the book trade, but also gives us a glimpse of people's involvement. And there is the Guild of St. John the Evangelist from the 15th century in Bruges, which required anyone working in the book trade to join. And between, I think it's 1454 and 1500, women made up a quarter of its members, and they were named apprentices, illuminators, and they owned workshops. So Christine Burns was an illuminator that ran a workshop around the late 15th century, and she trained men and women as illuminators. So it's really, really important when we see an unnamed work that we don't assume it was by a man.
Hmm. Definitely. And I think that's really interesting too, just that assumption, and then those little ways that women have just asserted themselves, even just in putting the name at Soto, sister.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot more kind of research being done. Um, and even women as authors, you've got Marjorie Kemp, and she wrote the earliest surviving autobiography by women in English, and it's an incredible piece of work. And Christine de Pizan, and she wrote some fantastic texts like The City of Ladies, and it's women did dominate these spaces, and it's just sometimes they might not be as obvious, particularly with the research that's been done in the past, or it's kind of just like you've got to look beneath the surface. And particularly with colophons, it's again, there's a lot that we don't know. Like people wouldn't sign or wouldn't leave a colophon. So we have no idea. Could that be a male scribe or a female scribe? It's just having that, taking away the assumption of, there's no name. It must mean it's a man. So yeah, it's a kind of different way of looking at it.
Yeah, very cool. And is there a fact that you really geek out over within your work?
Oh, this it's really hard to pick one.
I can
I think
imagine.
a particular one is birthing girdles. So it's kind of a really interesting use of a medieval manuscript was so a birthing girdle is quite a long, quite a thin manuscript, and basically it was assumed because of the way that they're shaped and also the prayers on them were kind of to help women during childbirth, that it would be wrapped around a pregnant woman's body during labor, and the kind of prayers would be recited as she was giving birth. And I think there's one, I think it's 15th century off the top of my head, and it's at the Wellcome collection. And they found that there was birthing fluid on the manuscript, which again shows us that, this was in a birthing chamber. Whether, they wrapped it around her or not, it's just like I think it's just so magical that manuscripts were used in this way. You don't just find them in book forms, you find them in other ways like that, or binding waste where book's been kind of taken apart or fallen apart over time, and it's been used, it's kind of had another life, it's reincarnated into something else, like a book binding, or um, you kind of sometimes see them down the spines of more modern books, which it's really cool. It's probably one of my like favorite things to find. Um, so yeah, manuscripts can often have either more unusual lives from what we think and kind of live outside of a traditional codex, or they can, live another life and you can find them transformed into something else.
Wow. That's so fascinating. But of course, the material was such high quality. Of course you would want to, if you're not using it anymore, put it into a new text and help build that up. I find that fascinating that it was involved in the birthing process in that way, because it really does speak to how words and the books that carry them have a magic on us. Like we can we can process grief better if we have this text that we can rub and refer to and go over. We can get through the terrors of pre-modern day birthing if we're wrapped in these words of comfort and prayer and protection. That is just gorgeous.
Mm.
Yeah.
No, they're very special, and there's just some things, yeah, so magical. Not many survive now, as obviously they were used, and also a lot of them were destroyed during the
Mm.
Reformation, and they are they're very, very magical objects, and it's just such a I remember the first time I saw one, I saw it online in an article and I was blown away. I didn't even think about a medieval manuscript being used in that context. But of course, it's, books help people, whether it's, personally when you're praying or, you know, to protect you during birth. And they won't, not every single person would have one. I think generally the church would be the people that would hand out birthing girdles to mothers if they wanted them. And it's just yeah, there's something very, very magic about that.
Yeah, yeah, and it's persisted, like um so many of us find such comfort in a poem from hundreds of years ago or a book that somehow the author managed to put into words exactly what we were feeling that we couldn't articulate ourselves. And so I love that across all the centuries that it is that we have been human, we are still the same. We're still finding that comfort in words. Oh my gosh. This has been such I'm like I want to just do so much more reading now because this has been such an illuminating chat. And for people listening at home, where can we find more information on this topic? Because the Google machine is huge. So where would you recommend us go first?
I think the you know, there's so much fantastic literature and it's quite overwhelming. But the one author and scholar that I would always recommend is Christopher de Hamel. The way in which he talks and describes manuscripts is so inspiring. It's as if they're living and breathing objects with personalities and histories, and I all of his books are fantastic, but a personal favorite of mine is Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts. That's a really fantastic place to kind of to start. And I also publish short form content on medieval manuscript history, and that covers things that I have in the shop and also wider history in itself. And for me, it's really important to make it accessible to wider audiences and inspire more and more people to get interested and research the area. So that's one way, or a couple of ways, I guess.
Perfect. And what I'll do is I'll put the links to your socials in the little blurby bit at the bottom of this episode because I would very much agree. The way that you present this information in your short form videos is very accessible to any walk of life, but it's so interesting and it just speaks to the passion that you have for this topic that someone who's probably never heard about a book of hours is able to watch this and just get so inspired. So yeah, I think it's very fantastic that you're bringing it into the modern era the way that you do. And thank you so much for joining me today. This has been such a treat and such a way to start off season 5 of Author Nook.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's honestly been so lovely chatting with you and with everyone. And yeah, hopefully people feel inspired to look into the medieval period because it's really, really exciting and there's just so much out there to discover.
Yeah, and even hearing that we still have 8,000 out of 110,000, I think you said, texts,
That still survive, yeah.
that's still a big old number, you know, for the amount of years that have separated us and when they were produced.
Hmm.
Yeah,
No,
there's
it's magic.
yeah, so magic. So, thank you so much for joining our chat, and listeners at home, thank you for joining us as we chatted all things medieval. If you liked what you heard, please take a minute to rate and follow this podcast or share it with a like-minded friend. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I release new episodes once a month with no set date, so a subscription or a follow means that you won't miss anything. However you wound up here, I hope you are well and living magically.